Well, allow me to share some breaking news. The Palm Beach Atlantic University women's volleyball team is in the Elite Eight of the NCAA. And most impressive and most important is they won today in their first quarterfinal round, which pushes them into the semifinals tomorrow. And we're all cheering for the frozen sailfish. Now, normally you wouldn't associate Palm Beach Atlantic University with the frozen sailfish, but our volleyball team playing in the NCAA Division II finals is competing in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where yesterday I checked and the weather in the early morning was 9 degrees. Isn't that why we all live and enjoy the beauty of Palm Beach and the campus of Palm Beach Atlantic University?
But South Dakota has no rule against perpetuity.
If you say so, Danny, it's right. It's right. Well, I welcome you to the campus of Palm Beach Atlantic University, and may I wish you a Merry Christmas and a prosperous and healthy New Year. Today marks the end of our exam period for the fall semester of 2016, and commencement is scheduled for the Palm Beach County Convention Center this Saturday at 2 o'clock, and we look forward to joining eager graduates of our undergraduate and graduate programs and their families as they enjoy that long-expected and well-deserved celebration. This is a special time on a university campus. It's especially a very, very exciting time at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and one of the reasons that we're excited is that tonight is yet another serious conversation with serious thought leaders brought to this campus by the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy. Would you join me in welcoming here to the Lassiter Rotunda of the Warren Library, Senator George LeMiuex and Governor Bob McDonnell. Welcome. Governor, it's an honor to have you at Palm Beach Atlantic University, and we hope this is just the first of many visits to our campus. We have several distinguished members of the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy Board of Advisors with us today. All of them are very special, but I want to single out one in particular because when I see him, he calls me Mr. President, and when I see him, I call him Mr. President. So join me in saluting the President of the Florida State Senate, Senator Joe Negron. Mr. President. Thank you. Senator LeMiuex, I'll introduce you for your opening remarks and the conversation tonight with a very distinguished American. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Good evening. We have a real treat tonight in having Governor Bob McDonnell speak with us, and I'm going to introduce him in a moment. But I also wanted to take the opportunity to talk about what we're doing at the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy at Palm Beach Atlantic. This is the second speaker that we've had in our speaker series this year. We had Senator Bob Graham, who joined us last month, and we will have 2 more speakers in January and February. So we've gone from having sort of 1 featured speaker a year to now having 4 featured speakers. So thank you for the support of everyone here to make that possible. In January, we will have Steve Forbes, who will speak to us, and then we're working and we'll soon have confirmed to you a very special speaker who is an advisor and commentator on presidential campaigns really without equal. So since we had somewhat of an exciting presidential campaign that just happened, I think that this gentleman is going to be able to help us navigate that election and what it means for the future of the country. It's now my privilege to introduce Governor Bob McDonnell. I've had the honor of knowing Governor McDonnell for many years, back all the way to when he was Attorney General. He is a person of great character, and it was always somebody that I looked up to. He started his career in the Virginia House of Representatives, which they call the House of Delegates, and served there, I believe, what, 7 terms in the House of Delegates? Prior to that, he served in the United States Army as a lieutenant colonel. He has degrees from Boston University, from Notre Dame, from Regent University. After he was in the House of Delegates, he ran for Attorney General, and that's when you got the moniker Landslide Bob, right? I think he won by 323 votes. We know...
360, they did a recount.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't want to cheat you out of those 40. We know about close elections in Florida, so we're familiar with that. And after he was Attorney General, he became the governor of the state of Virginia, where he did a lot of great work to help Virginia recover from the worst recession that Virginia had since the Great Depression, just like the recession that we suffered through here in Florida, getting Virginians back to work. Served with great distinction as governor. He's going to talk to you tonight about his journey, because it's been a journey with ups and downs, and it's been a journey of faith that is really, I think, the most important part of the discussion. There have been some really big highs in his career. He was thought to be a potential candidate for President of the United States. He gave the response to President Obama from the Virginia House of Delegates after the State of the Union. I was in the Senate when you did that and remembered how proud I was of you to represent my party and what a great job you did. So this is going to be a really unique experience tonight, and we are one of the first groups of people here at Palm Beach Atlantic University to have Governor McDonnell speak since his win in front of the United States Supreme Court. So without any further ado, let me introduce to you the Governor of the state of Virginia, Governor Bob McDonnell.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Senator, for that very kind introduction, and for our longstanding friendship, and for your work here at Palm Beach Atlantic and standing up the LeMiuex Center to be able to talk about the matters of faith in government and politics that are critically important, I think, in where we are in America today. And I appreciate your service in the U.S. Senate. Wish you were still there, because I think you did a terrific job, and he continues to lead here. And President Fleming, thanks for having me back. Yeah, as we discussed, Virginians care about this place. It's not just the weather, but Virginians give a lot of money to your university, so I just want you to know we're trying to do our part, and we'll continue to do that. And thank you for having me back. It's a remarkable place where you're not afraid to say Merry Christmas, you're not afraid of your faith, you're not afraid of the gospel, and you're not afraid to talk about the status of America today and find out how it needs to be improved. And so I really am grateful for that. And Senator Negron, it's nice to see you. You obviously know the rough and tumble world of politics, and thank you for coming tonight to be part of this. I spoke to Governor Scott this weekend. I love the governor, but we have a great rivalry about which state is most competitive for business. And I came down here, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago and spoke. He asked me to come down and speak at the Republican Party of Florida dinner, and after it was all over, he called me back up, and he had this trophy that must have been that high. And it looked great, except it had a number 6 on the top of it. I've never been given a trophy with number 6, so he goes on to say he had found some obscure study where Florida was number 1 on a business ranking and Virginia was only number 6, and so he gave me this. So I just want you to know, your governor is constantly on the job, just trying to compete for jobs, and he's a good man. You're lucky to have a guy that understands business like Rick Scott. And thank all of you, trustees and people that love this university and are contributing to it, and students. I suppose some of you are students, awesome, and people from the community, and I'm glad to be able to be here and just share a few thoughts with you. And I want to talk to you about a couple of important topics. I want to talk to you about hope, and about servant leadership, and about overcoming adversity, because those are some of the things that I've learned over the last few years in government, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer, George, after that, where we can get down and find out what you want learn about. So I've had the pleasure of being in public life now for 38 years, since I was an Army lieutenant, to taking the job of Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry. I'm glad to be here with Josh Kellum. He introduced me to Bible study last night and said I was the greatest governor in the history of Virginia. And then, of course, when I reminded everybody Jefferson and Henry, the first two governors, he had no credibility left. But Josh, I'm glad you're here tonight. It was a nice introduction anyway, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you for a few minutes, because, well, being Attorney General and Governor and Lieutenant Colonel, all that's cool. You know, after the last 3.5 years of my life, I realized that, you know, when I have to count for my life and stand before the throne, God's not going to ask me to think about those jobs. But He will ask me about how I did in following the two great commandments. Did I love God? Did I love my neighbor? And so when you go through ups and downs of life, you start to change the filter, the lens of your life. You look at things, hear things differently, and you realize that there's a lot more things important that sometimes we get caught up in day to day that we think are the priorities in life. And so I want to talk to you about that, because that's one of the things that I've learned out of this ordeal. You know, I've been blessed most of my life to have a lot of success. I got 5 children, 4 grandchildren. I want to tell you about those grandchildren in a minute. Of course, they're the most beautiful grandchildren you've ever seen. I've got pictures afterwards I can show you to prove it. You know, for about 58 years of my life, I was just on a roll. I had very few problems, and God was so good to me beyond my wildest dream. For average kid from Northern Virginia to grow up and have Thomas Jefferson's job, it just doesn't get much better than that. And I assembled a team around me when I was governor. There were a lot of people of faith and people that didn't want to make excuses, wanted to get results, wanted to get big things done, realizing talk is cheap, results count, right, Senator? No, you can talk during campaigns, but ultimately people can look at your record and find out how well did you really do. So, and we need more of that in the country, and I think this president actually may be serious about getting stuff done. So I was fortunate to win that race back in 2009. By the way, I did have a landslide then. I ran against the same guy that I'd beat by 360 votes and won by about 400,000 the second time, so it was actually a little better the second time around. So I was very blessed, you know, to have that job, and thought we were doing some things that were right. And I just spent just about every waking moment thinking about what can I do better, how can I create more jobs, how can I beat Rick Scott today. You know, that was kind of the way I looked at and Rick Perry, of course. Those were my favorite competitors because they always told me how great their states were. And then I went home from work on February 15th of 2013, and my wife told me that she'd just been interviewed by the FBI and the state police. And after a short period of time talking to her, I realized that they were not investigating a misdeed by our chef, but they were actually investigating my wife and me. I can't begin to tell you what that did to sort of turn my world upside down. You know, my parents had always taught me, follow the golden rule. My dad was a World War II vet, career Air Force officer. My mom stayed at home with the 5 kids and just did a beautiful job telling us about life and the gospel. And now, all of a sudden, the government of my country that I'd served for 21 years in uniform was now saying that I had done something wrong. You know, my life changed at that moment. And I knew that I was probably in for a fairly long ordeal. I mean, I knew with all my heart I didn't do anything wrong. I knew what the laws were. I knew what the requirements were for reporting. And yet, there was allegations that were made right then that there was something amiss with the way that I had conducted my office. So the next couple months were extremely difficult. On Easter Sunday morning, the Washington Post had glaring headlines that was the first article about my case. I thought, thank you, God, I got crucified Easter Sunday morning. That's very nice of you. I really appreciate that. And it kind of went downhill from there with just daily stories about this case and my relationship with a particular donor to our campaign. And I got to the point where I was really wondering, you know, how is this really going to turn out right? You know, I've got my staff being interviewed, my kids being hauled in front of grand juries. Everybody in my family had lawyers. We were spending a lot of money, subpoenas flying every week. That we took a lot of time in that last year as governor to try to govern well. And then in that summer, a couple important things happened. My staff and cabinet did what every good staff and cabinet does. You know, when the boss is freaking out, you get him out of there. So they said, you need to go somewhere where you can take a little different view of the world. So they sent me to Afghanistan, which is great because I was the commander of the National Guard. That's what you do as governor, as part of your job. And we had a lot of kids in harm's way, a unit over there. So it was a remarkable trip to go to Kuwait and Afghanistan and then go see the kids in the hospital at Landstuhl and then Walter Reed. And it really helped to fix my perspective that, and this is an important lesson, no matter how bad your circumstances are in your life, there's a lot of other people that have it a lot worse than you. And the more you dwell on your own problems, the worse it's going to seem. But if you get out of that for a while and look at the perspective and the role and the burdens that other people face in their life, it can put things in a lot different perspective and allow you to deal with it a lot better. And so when I got to speak to those kids in Kabul and Kandahar, it just really gave me a new look at things, these people being in harm's way like that. And then I came back and I started reading the Psalms, which I hadn't done in a very, very long time. And I did that because David, who was the great king of Israel, was also a horrible guy. He was a murderer, he was an adulterer, and yet after his repentance, God said, you're a man after my own heart, and I am going to plant in you the seed from which the Savior of the world will come, and the Savior will come from the house of David. What an amazing story of God's grace for those who repent and those who really have a servant's heart. And so David, out of that experience, wrote beautiful writings in the book of Psalms, and I felt like God impressed on my heart Psalm 35. And so, anybody here a sinner, by the way? Okay, one, that's good. Josh, I figured it was you. Okay. Anybody ever been through any tough times? Okay. Well, look, it's the human condition. I know you're very shy to raise your hand, but this is the human condition. We fall short of the glory of God, and we go through difficult, adverse times, sometimes because of our own dumb decisions, and sometimes things that are unjust that are thrust upon us that we never expect and are not fair, and sometimes a combination of those two. But that's the human condition. So in Psalm 35, it's a great story of David's travail. Somebody was always out to get David, you know, whether it was Saul or one of the enemies of Israel. Somebody was always laying traps for him, giving false testimony against him, and he lays all this out and basically says, you know, God, where are you? You know, contend for me and come awake and arise to my defense. And then he goes in this beautiful last couple sentences that says, in your righteousness, vindicate me. And it goes on to talk about the principle of vindication for a couple sentences. And so I just adopted that with all my heart, that was something that I needed to do. I needed to do like Dave. I needed to trust in the Lord. I need to be patient. I am very bad at being patient because people that are presidents or business leaders or busy moms, I mean, you don't have time to be patient. You've got to do stuff now. You want to do it yesterday. And when you're governor, in Virginia, I had 110,000 people and a $96 billion budget. I could do a lot. But when you go from governor to indicted in 10 days, you realize you're pretty much powerless against a federal government. So I had to rely and trust on the Lord because there's nowhere else to go. Lawyers, a justice system that I've been part of that I thought usually got it right, and this whole concept that God, through His righteousness, and me trusting in Him and being patient, that He would find a way to vindication. And so I thought, that's good. Got out of office, 10 days later indicted, about 5 months later a trial. We had a 6-week trial. I testified for 4 days. I just believed with all my heart, as did I think everybody else in the courtroom, that it was going to be okay. That a juror of my peers, hearing that evidence for that period of time and listening to what happened, that they just wasn't evidence under the law. And then on September 4th, I listened to the bailiff read 11 guilty verdicts for me and 9 for my wife. And that was obviously the worst day of my life. I just wept. I just could not believe that even though I had faith and I had trusted that this was going to be the result. So I just had to believe the appeals process was going to be right. The lead lawyer in my case told me about 6 months before the indictment that the way the law was in the circuit, the Fourth Circuit, that I very well would have to go to the U.S. Supreme Court in order to win. And of course I said, wait a minute, you're my lawyer. Are you telling me I got to get convicted first and then go through appeals? Do you not have another plan? Because that's not a very good plan in my view. And he just said, well, I'm just saying this is the way it is, that this is the government's after you. They're going to make an example out of you under this section of the law. And the appeals courts are not good on this issue in the Fourth Circuit. So unfortunately, he turned out to be both right and prophetic in that, but helped to prepare me that that was going to happen. So a conviction came in September. And on January the 6th, I was actually sentenced to 2 years in the federal penitentiary. And I remember telling God, hey, I really appreciate that free public housing, but you know, I've had it for a while and I really don't need it. Can you do something about this? And that's when some miracles really started to happen, because 6 days later, in January 12th of 2014, we had our first grandchild that was born on her mother's birthday. And I just felt like that was a sign that God was telling us that, hang in there, I've got this, and your future is not about the penitentiary. Your future is about hope, and it's about grandchildren, and that's what I want you to focus on. So that was great. 2 weeks later, we got a remarkable verdict from the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to actually grant bond pending appeal to the Fourth Circuit. In August of last year, August 20th, our appeal was turned down by the Fourth Circuit. They then turned down a bond pending appeal to the United States Supreme Court a couple days later on August 22nd. And another remarkable thing happened, because 6 days after that, my second daughter had our second grandchild on her birthday. And I said, okay, God, this is cool. There's a pattern here. I like it. You are in charge. Grandchildren are in the future. But I said, you know, I still got this problem, and that is I got this 2-year sentence, and you need to do something about that. And my lawyer said, you will never get bond pending appeal to the Supreme Court. They haven't done it in 40 years. And so as bad as this is, you need to go get your affairs in order. You need to get your prison glasses. You need to get your will and your advanced medical directive. You need to get all that straightened out, because you're going to have to go. We'll fight this appeal with everything we got, but you're going to have to report. And 3 days later, the United States Supreme Court, in a brief opinion by John Roberts, said that you have been granted bond pending appeal on August 31st of last year, the first time in 40 years. I don't understand it. I don't know why in my case they did that, but I just know that because God is sovereign, and because I tried with everything I had to be peaceful and to trust in Him and to wait upon Him and to focus on what I was trying to do one day at a time and to enjoy those grandchildren, that He allowed me to have that gift of freedom in August of last year. In the following this January of this year, the Fourth Circuit, the U.S. Supreme Court granted the writ of certiorari and granted us the appeal, which they do in one out of 600, 800, depending on what year it is, cases. But they agreed to hear our case, which gave me great optimism. And then, of course, a month later, Justice Scalia died. And Justice Scalia was the one who had written brilliant opinions saying why the law in my case was unconstitutional, joined by 2 or 3 other justices. And so I thought, okay, God, why are you doing this? I mean, this is my champion. And he died. So I need you to find another champion for him. So fast forward, we walk into the Supreme Court of the United States, the last court of appeal for me, the court of last resort, the last case of the term, the last argument of the day. And after half an hour of argument, in my case, the government gets up there and utters one sentence, and Justice Roberts immediately begins to light into him and say he had a brief in his hand that the White House counsel for the last 5 presidents had all signed, and said that he was wrong, the government was wrong, and this was tremendous overreach and would hamper federalism. And was enforcing vague laws against a state official, and on and on and on. And then Justice Breyer, liberal Democrat, got up and did much of the same, except he was even worse in citing the overreach and the incredible power of federal prosecutors, and they had to get the law right. And for the first time, I felt a sense of justice after not having one judge, not one juror, believing our arguments. The United States Supreme Court seemed to be incredibly receptive to what we were telling them, not just about me or my case, that was irrelevant, but about what the rule of law would do in this case to the body politic if it was endorsed. And we were fortunate to have 13 separate amicus briefs from around the country that were filed, Democrats and Republicans, business people, law professors, that all weighed in about why this was an incorrect view of the law. And then the miracle happened. June 27th, the Supreme Court of the United States, on a unanimous 8-0 decision, overturned the case, vacated the convictions, and remanded it back to the lower court to determine whether or not there was sufficient evidence to allow the government to retry the case. And then 90 days ago today, 3 months ago today, the federal government decided we do not have a case, and we're going to drop the case. So it was an amazing voyage for me, and I wanted to share just the facts with you because there's a couple takeaways that I wanted to give you from that. You know, that day, on September 9th, the day after the federal government decided to drop the case, the lead paper in the state, which is the Richmond Times-Dispatch. How many of you have been to Virginia? Oh, wow, that's pretty good. Good. Well, Richmond is the capital of the state, the seat of government, and the headlines on the Richmond Times-Dispatch that next day was one word: vindication. And that's when I knew. I said, "Okay, God, I get it now. You know, you gave me that Psalm 35 that if I trusted in you and in your righteousness, I would be vindicated if I waited patiently." And that's the headline the next day in the paper. So that's my story. I'm now in the restoration phase, and God has done amazing things to help restore us. Get the law license back, the right to vote back. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention, in that meantime, 30 days after the Supreme Court oral argument and 30 days before the Supreme Court opinion, we had 2 more grandchildren, twin boys, born on their grandmother's birthday. So, you know, when you don't think God's quite at work, He's at work. And so now I got my life back, and God is doing remarkable things, as in the book of Job, to restore those years the locusts have eaten. How many of you read Job? I never read about that dude, you know, before I got into this mess. And I thought, well, everybody's told me a lot about Job and how to suffer well. So I thought I better read him. So I noticed after reading Job that almost the whole book is about suffering and all the unfair things that happened to Job. And it was all stuff because God made a deal in chapter 1 with the devil that he was going to let Job be tested, but he knew that he would give him the faith to believe and endure, even though he spent half of the chapter shaking his fist at God. And you have to get to the last 3 chapters where it basically said he restored everything double, he had beautiful daughters, the end. But that's not the point. The point is how to suffer well, because there's some things the scriptures say, and I think your experience of life would lead you to believe that there are some things that can only be done in your heart and be done to build character in you through suffering. I've been blessed with a lot of success, but I've learned a heck of a lot more through ordeal and trials. You know, the first book of James has a beautiful thing that says, it's hard scripture, but it says that consider it joy to endure many trials of every kind, because in those trials you will learn through faith the gift of perseverance, and through perseverance you will be made perfect and mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So it's hard to be joyful going through this stuff. I got a few points where I said, thank you for letting me go through this, because I'm going to be a better person. And now that, of course, I'm out of it, it's a lot easier to be joyful looking back and saying, hey, thanks a lot for that experience, and thanks for saving the public housing for somebody else. But I appreciate the fact that I've gone through that experience, because I really do feel like George and I were talking, a better changed man for that. And I've learned just a couple things out of that, and I'll share those with you. One is the lens I mentioned to you of eternity. This life is fleeting. And so the two rules in life is serve God, love your neighbor. If you do those things well, you know, when you account for your life, it'll be well done, thou good and faithful servant. Secondly, is live this day. Live today. I spent most of my life living tomorrow. The next campaign, the next election, the next bill. Senator, does that sound familiar? It's hard to focus on today when you're in this stuff, whether you're a business leader, a president of a university where you got 3-year plans, 5-year plans, 6, whatever your plans are. You know, the next, how you're going to get the money raised for this next capital campaign. I mean, it's always about the future. And so I'm actually stopping and smelling roses now. You know, I've cut a lot of rose bushes, but I never stopped and smelled them. But now I realize today is important. Why? Because Jesus said, you look at the birds of the air, and not one of them falls without God knowing about it. You look at the lilies of the field, and not Solomon in all his splendor was as radiant as one of those, and yet they're pulled up and thrown into the fire. And he said, so don't worry about tomorrow. You know, today's got enough problems of its own. That's why we say in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. It's what God did in the desert when the Israelites were wandering. They got one day of bread. Why? Because he wanted them to trust him that day, and then the next day, and then the next day. So living this day, living it well, planning for the future. Don't live in the past, plan for the future, but live this day fully, because that's what you've got. That's all you got today is today. So I think that's important. Thirdly, I've learned, and Senator, no, I mean, I've only been in government 38 years, so I think I can say this. Don't put too much trust in government. Number one, they can let you down. The justice system in America is the best justice system in the world, but it's not perfect. And it's made up of imperfect people. And power does things to people that have them make bad decisions from time to time. I've made some bad decisions in government from time to time. But ultimately, and Senator, I think you probably agree with this, government is not what makes America great by any stretch. You know, the scriptures say in Romans 13 that the government is the civil ruler whose job is to punish the wrongdoer and to do you good. So it's a kind of a limited box. You know, you look at what the federal government does today, it's a lot longer list than that, wouldn't you say, Senator? A little bit outside of Article 1, Section 8 box, wouldn't you say? A little bit of trampling on the 9th and 10th Amendments, wouldn't you say? He's my kind of guy. It's not bad for a federal guy, huh? I know you agree, Senator, because, you know, we see what's going on in Washington. You got to scratch your head about the trampling of the rights of the states and localities. But I've learned, you know, that's not what's been great about this country for 240 years, since the second governor of Virginia wrote the Declaration of Independence. By the way, that's my one beef with Jefferson. He picked out what went on his tombstone. Do you know what he did? He only put on there that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was the forerunner to the First Amendment, and that he was the founder of the University of Virginia. I understand universities are important, but you know what he left off? He left off he was governor of Virginia. What was he thinking? And president of the United States. But I mean, it just shows you, in all due respect, about what Jefferson thought was important about life, and it was principles and rights and in education. But America is the most generous country on earth. We give more time, talent, treasure, foreign aid than any people on earth, even though most people don't appreciate it. It's the churches, it's the synagogues, it's our benevolent institutions, it's the universities, especially the private ones that believe in God. It's the people that donate their time and their money to the Boys and Girls Clubs or the American Cancer Society. I mean, that's why we're great. That's what de Tocqueville said when he wrote his book, Democracy in America. That's what he found out, is why we're great. So you put your faith in government, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House to that degree, you're going to be disappointed. Now, we should support good people in office, but government has its limits about what it can do. It certainly can't save you. It certainly can harm you, but it can't save you. That comes through faith and trust and belief. So I'm going to close with just this idea is, and Senator LeMieux and I were talking about this too a little bit, is we have got to realize, and most of you are called to be leaders, and I hope you young people that are here, I hope you'll think about being leaders no matter what your profession is, especially if you're going to a Christian-based university, you know, you have a duty to lead. You know, you're not given the special gift of faith and the wisdom at a university like this to just go out and be average. You should be excellent, and you should think about leading in whatever you do. And you should think about being a good citizen and giving back to those who are less fortunate. I'm sure you talk about that all the time. But I think some of the most powerful scriptures there are is when Jesus was refereeing the fight among his disciples about who was greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You know, disciples are kind of like politicians, kind of like senators, right? They fight all the time, you know. So they were having this debate, you know, about who was the greatest, and said Jesus, being the smart leader that he was, said, okay. He said, for you to be great, you must be the servant of all. You must serve before you can be great. And as evidence of that, he said, the Son of Man, me, Jesus, came not to be served, but to serve. To me, it's a powerful example of the kind of leaders that he expects us to be, people of faith. You know, to do everything you can, be energetic, aggressive, enthusiastic, not for yourself, but for the good of other people. That's the kind of leadership that he expects. And secondly, we're at a kind of a dangerous point in American politics where the tipping point towards demagoguery and vitriol has you know, got us a little bit on a dangerous course. And so trying to restore some sense of civility in our politics is probably a good thing. George Washington wrote a brilliant book when he was 16 years old, 110 Rules of Civility. Anybody read it? Okay, Psalm 35, Philippians 4, and George Washington's 116 Rules on Civility. That's your homework, okay? Can I give homework? Okay. Those will serve you well. Another great Virginian, by the way, George Washington. But the point is that there used to be a time, not so long ago. Senator, how many years you been in? 2000. You guys got term limits here, don't you? So you got some turnover, right? Yeah, yeah. What is it, 12 years? 8 years. 8 years in each house. You were in the lower house first and the Senate? Okay. You know, it used to be in the 80s, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill would talk and they'd disagree and then they'd have a beer and they'd work something out. You know, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich used to talk, you know, the roaring 90s, right? They found a way to work stuff out on some things, and we got welfare reform, and we got, you know, all this technology boom. But now, it's just we win, you lose. And I don't want to just beat you, I want to destroy you. It's a very different rhetoric, and that's all happened in the last 15 years. I don't think the current president's helped that a lot. In fact, I think he's contributed to it with some division. But I think that part of what people that adopt a principle of servant leadership need to do is to find a way to get people to work together, share the credit. That's what one of Reagan's great quotes is, you know, it's amazing how much can get done if you don't care who gets the credit. You know, I don't think enough people in leadership really believe that anymore. It's that I want a lot of things to get done, and I want to get the credit because I want to get reelected and raise a bunch of money, whatever the case might be. And so I have the advantage now being out of office and looking in my rearview mirror a little bit to be able to conclude some of those things. And, you know, we have a great democracy, and we're the greatest and strongest country on earth. We certainly have our challenges. And I think that all of you, as people of faith, supporters of this great university, learning here, dialoguing about the important issues of the day, will be really important parts of solving some of these problems in America. Some of them can be solved in Washington. A lot of them can be created in Washington, and they're going to be solved in Tallahassee and Richmond and places like that where governments are closer to the people. But most of them will be solved by business leaders, by family organization leaders, within the home. That's where the real work of democracy ultimately is done. So thanks for letting me share just a little bit about my little minor disagreement with the federal government. I'm really delighted that the Supreme Court got this right, not just for me and my family really, but for any donor, any business person, anybody who runs for office, anybody who wants to use their First Amendment rights to speak and contribute at the same time, that they don't get disenfranchised. And I'm really blessed to be here in the vindicated and restoration phase. So thanks for having me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. That was great. Before we have a conversation here and some questions, I want to take an opportunity to recognize some of the folks that make our Public Policy Center work. We couldn't bring such great speakers to Palm Beach Atlantic. We couldn't provide our students who are doing research the stipends they need to be able to do that research without an advisory board of great citizens who help us with the LeMiuex Center for Public Policy. And some of them are here tonight. I want to recognize them. First, James Donnelly. Everyone give him a round of applause. Francis Fisher. Dr. Bob Hemholt. Brian Burns. Josh Kellum. And I want to give an extra special thanks to Josh because of his good efforts, we were able to bring the governor here. And also Senator Joe Negron, the president of the Florida Senate. So, Governor, tell us where you were the moment you found out that the U.S. Supreme Court had vindicated you.
I was in the office. Josh and I worked together at the ESG companies and in Virginia Beach, and so I was sitting in that office. You know, we had the rare advantage. We knew the decision was coming that day because there were only 3 cases left on the docket. And the previous Thursday, on June, I think it was 23rd, Justice Roberts announced that all the remaining opinions would be handed down that Monday, the 27th. So, like, you normally don't know when they're coming down. You have a window. So, I mean, we knew it was coming. So, we had the victory party and the funeral planned that night. You know, whichever one it was going to be. So I was sitting in my office, and I actually invited friends in, and so we knew the cases were going to be handed down at 10 o'clock. And we, of course, had it on the SCOTUS blog, which is a Supreme Court blog where you could listen in live and listen to what was going on. It's actually a blog, or you can't actually hear the justices. That's just the rules of the court. So, you know, the text started to stream down, and I have to say, I was just very hopeful in my heart after the oral argument, because it just seemed like almost all the justices were all over the government, but you don't ever know until you know. And when we saw, you know, McDonnell versus the U.S. unanimous decision for the petitioner, I mean, the room just sort of went up in flames with my family and my friends. We were all there. I had a call in from my family, my brothers and sisters around the country, and it was a moment of just unbelievable exhilaration, tears after 43 months of the battle, and just an amazing sense of relief and release, and that God had given us our life back, and it was beautiful.
You had to deal with FBI, the Justice Department.
Yeah.
Both of which, through time in this country, have been venerated institutions. Mm-hmm. And in the last couple of years, the shine has really come off of the FBI and the Justice Department. And we asked folks to prepare questions for you here tonight, and a couple people specifically were concerned that those institutions have become political. And governors before you and governors after you have conducted themselves in a way similar to you as you were in office and have not been prosecuted, have not been indicted. Do you feel that there is politics in those institutions, and do you think that politics had something to play with your indictment?
You know, people in law enforcement are human beings too. I was a prosecutor for a number of years, attorney general, and I think overwhelmingly the people that go into those professions are decent, good, honorable people that believe in the rule of law and do an incredibly good job. But you can't I don't think you can fully take one's biases out of anything, whether you're a sitting judge or you know, an FBI agent. I really think that's really for them to have to account. They were obviously sternly remanded in the opinion by the Supreme Court about what this theory of law would do and why it should not be brought, and really rein back in a pretty significant number of notches in what they're going to be able to do in the future. So why they brought the case, I mean, our lawyers argued vehemently at the beginning this case should have never been brought. And yet they chose to do it, George. So I can't fully ascribe the motives. I thought it was a little curious that at the same time we had Chris Christie, Rick Perry, Scott Walker, and me all under investigation by prosecutors of the opposite party. That did ring a little curious to me. All people that were at least mentioned for running for some other higher office. But I don't know if it was politics with a big P or maybe more of a little p, where you have prosecutors that get a little out of control, like in the Senator Ted Stevens case, where that case was reversed. Unfortunately, he died shortly after that, and the prosecutors were reprimanded. There have been other cases like that, but the problem is these statutes are so vague. And Justice Breyer did a beautiful job in the Supreme Court, again, liberal Democrat, in analyzing this issue. And if you all ever have any free time and want to really listen to this, if you go to Scotus blog, McDonnell versus U.S., click on it, just listen to the last half an hour, the oral argument in which Roberts started, and then Kennedy, and then Breyer in a withering discourse against the government essentially talked about the lack of accountability of a federal prosecutor. And when you combine that with a vague law, you really have unbridled discretion. And that violates everything we believe about the rule of law. The law has to be certain and clear. So you know, that's the essence of due process, Senator, as you know. You got to know what it is so you know how to govern yourself as to whether your conduct is across the line or not. I never believed for a moment that anything that I did in referring donors to meetings and that I didn't go to, didn't know what happened, or having them come to cocktail parties, that would be somehow part of a corruption scheme. I've never in a million years ever thought that. So I don't really know. And you know, God has really blessed me with not being, I'm not angry, I'm not vitriolic, I'm not pointing any fingers. I think there should be accountability when people abuse power. But so I can't really tell you what the ultimate motives were, but it was clearly a theory of the law that was beyond any that had been approved by any court up until that point. And so I think that's why we got the unanimous reversal.
Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts said that, you know, this prosecution would create a pall over government being able to do its job.
Yes.
And also people being involved in the public process, being
Yes.
able, constituents to be able to go see their elected officials and ask for a meeting, right?
Yes.
Hey, I've got this great business. How can I get to this university? How can I get to this agency of government and tell them about this business that I have that's going to create jobs in my state? So do you think that your prosecution chilled the democratic process, at least in Virginia?
I do. It's more than just Virginia. I mean, we had, shortly after the indictment, the president of the Senate of Virginia and the Speaker of the House invited the FBI to come in and said, you know, we're really shocked at this. What's the rules? Because, you know, in Virginia it was unlimited campaign contributions, unlimited gifts, unlimited loans. I mean, whatever you wanted to do, you just had to report everything. Was a sunshine rule. You do what you need to do, but just report it. Full disclosure so the public can make up their decision. So they were frightened, literally. And so they had the FBI come in, actually just went into the Senate, and my lawyer went into the House and tried to explain what they thought the law was. And they came out no clearer than when they went in. That's for their quotes in the paper. So, and that's the problem with vague criminal laws. It violates all those tenets of due process, George. So it wasn't just there, but and it wasn't just the focus in my case, obviously, was on the elected official. But the same rules apply to the donor who might want to give a contribution, and then maybe a week or a month later, they're in for a meeting with the elected official, completely unrelated to the donation, but they're talking about a policy issue. And all of a sudden, a federal official comes in and says, well, that's pretty close in time, and there had to be a connection, there had to be a wink and a nod, and therefore it looks like a quid pro quo, and we're going to indict you. That's the danger of that. There was not a scintilla of evidence in my case of any quid pro quo, of meaning an exchange, no agreement, because there wasn't any. And so, but just because of the proximity of time, the theory was that there was some wink and a nod, there was some relationship. So it absolutely put a chilling effect in Virginia. There were some rules changes. Nobody started to go out to dinner with anybody anymore. And I know that happened in a lot of other states as well. And I think why people were glad that now, through this process, the law has been clarified. And look, I'm not for a minute defending excesses. You know, if I could go back again, I would certainly do some things differently. Just because something is legal, that doesn't mean it's always the best judgment. And I, in the busyness of my office, made some decisions that I would not make again. Not that it was illegal, but it just might have created an appearance of something going on that wasn't true. I mean, it was a false narrative that the government provided to the jury. But we should never tolerate people that are in office that are doing things that violate the oath of office, violate the public trust, and are in it for self-serving reasons. That violates all the other things we believe about public service. So those laws need to be in place. But when they're so absolutely vague to give unfettered discretion to a federal prosecutor, that's the danger, and that's why I think Justice Breyer and others agreed to unanimously reverse the verdict.
There's that old expression that, you know, victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat only one. I'm sure there were a lot of people who were your friends, or said they were your friends, who, after you were indicted, were not to be heard from. I was impressed with Senator Warner when he was interviewed before the government decided to drop the charges, yes, and said publicly, Democratic U.S. Senator, former governor of Virginia, that no, I don't think they should bring the charges. This case is over. Yeah. Tell us some of the good stories about the people who stuck with you, the surprising people, because I'm sure there were people that you didn't expect. I'm sure there were people who you thought would be with you through thick and thin who weren't, and then I'm sure you were surprised with some people who were there for you.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and this is a concept that's familiar, I'm sure, to many of you. If you go through tough times, you know, who's there with you and who's not. And of course, my family was my absolute rock during that time. You know, they also indicted my wife, who was also convicted. She's not a public official. Her sin was being married to me, and but they were using her to create this conspiracy theory to be able to get to me. That's what it was really all about. But my family was amazingly supportive through all of the tough times, especially when, you know, early on when I was trying to govern and be under investigation. The last 10 months in office were very, very difficult. But on the broader point, it wasn't just Senator Warner, but Governor McAuliffe, the current Democratic governor, said the same thing. You know, this is over, let's drop it. And, you know, he understands more than most the relationship between money and politics as former head of the DNC, as he was renting out the Lincoln bedroom for President Clinton, which he's denied. But so I would say, you know, amazingly, and this is the absolute truth, I have felt more love and support over the last 3 years than any other time in my life. You know, when you're not in office anymore, you have no power other than a title as former. I mean, there's nothing I could do for anybody. What I needed them was to pray for me, to love me, to accept me, to contribute to my legal defense fund, and it happened overwhelmingly. There were a handful of people that I'm not going to mention who disappointed me, that I thought, you know, they've been through some tough times, or I've been there for them, and they just were kind of invisible. Some of them have resurfaced since the verdict, which is kind of nice too, and expected, I guess, in a way. But I feel like I gained so many more friends and allies than I lost. If you look at the amicus briefs that were filed in this case, you know, this former White House counsel from Reagan to Obama, every administration, in fact, 2 from Obama, that signed on or publicly wrote op-eds about our position, 83 former attorneys general of Virginia and our most 46 states that signed on, and countless business leaders, and there were 88 members of the Virginia House and Senate that signed on, over half of the legislature. And ironically, every time we filed 3 rounds of briefs as we went through 3 different courts, and unsurprisingly, every brief they got a few more signatures, like by a factor of maybe a third. Yes, people started to see what was really going on here. People got more courage, and that was nice. But I tell you, God gave us amazing favor. You know, the book of Hebrews describes faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And so while he expects us to believe and gives us that gift of faith to believe, he doesn't expect it to be blind faith. You know, he says in Romans that the very creation cries out to testify to the existence of a God. You can't look at the ocean or the sky or the moon or the stars or the microorganism species and not come to the conclusion that there must be an intelligent design that put all this together. Well, I think it's the same with faith. I mean, he wanted me to believe that this was going to end up okay, but you know, every time I walked into the local supermarket or the gas station, there was almost, without exception, someone who would come up for 30 seconds or a minute or two and say, you know, Governor, we're with you. We don't like what's happening to you. We're sorry that your family's been hurt. This is not right. And you hang in there, and we're praying for you and more. You don't know how many people are praying for you. And I can't tell you what that did. People that I never saw before, never seen again. I call them angels. Angels just aren't some, you know, spooky guy in a white outfit. It comes from the word angelos, which is messenger. I know you know that, Doctor. So I got these messengers along the way. I really felt they were supernatural to just say, just hang in there. And that's what allowed me to live that one day at a time. I can't explain that fully to you. I've never experienced anything like that in my life before. But I just had this amazing peace and confidence that if I just wouldn't endure, be patient, pray, be faithful, try to do the right thing every day, that it was going to be okay. And those people that didn't leave, those new friends that wrote the briefs or saw me at the gas station and said something nice, really made all the difference in being able to get through it.
Let's talk a little bit about the point you made about federalism.
Yes.
I know that this is an important topic to you.
Yeah.
You're a governor. As a governor, you realize that where government works is locally, that you know, counties, cities, and states really serve the people. They're closest to the people. They're much more efficient. They're much more effective.
Absolutely.
And the federal government keeps getting bigger and bigger. You mentioned Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates the powers of the government, and we've gotten far afield from that.
Absolutely.
Our former governor, Governor Bush, has recently penned an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal saying we should have a constitutional convention. And part of that convention should do three things. One, require a balanced budget. Two, require term limits of members of Congress. And three, circumscribe Article 1, Section 8 and the Commerce Clause and really limit specifically the power.
I missed that. That's great.
Is that something that, are we to that point where
I'm going to get on my feet to talk about this one because I'm a little proud of Virginia. You know, the Virginians wrote a good chunk of that Declaration, Mr. Jefferson, and the Constitution, Mr. Madison. And you know, it's been 240 years since the Declaration, 220-some since the Constitution, but I think you would agree, Senators, it's the most brilliant set of political documents ever written because it's given birth and rise to the greatest country on the history of Earth. This American experiment in self-government is brilliant. You know, that presupposes a moral people. It presupposes people of faith, as the founder said. But it creates this wonderfully balanced separation of duties, not just between three different branches of government, but between the federal and the state and the local governments. And the reason they did that is they understood this concentration of power in King George and what that did to their freedom. And they understood that government needed to be separated. Too much power in one person does really bad things. And so they understood that having decisions made in Tallahassee are a heck of a lot better than decisions made 1,000 miles away from where you live in Washington, D.C. by people that work 3 days a week there and then come home maybe and campaign a lot. And no offense, Senator.
None taken.
But they were brilliant. And honestly, I think one of the mistakes that we've made is the 17th Amendment. You know, senators are now elected and they're not accountable to the states anymore. They used to be appointed by state legislatures, you know, before that happened. I think the founders may have had that right. But the broader point is the question of federalism, and that is keeping the federal government in that box of Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated limited powers, very much a tightly crafted deal among the drafters of the Constitution back in 1787 to put that delicate balance together. And then to make sure they got enough votes, at the same time they drafted the Bill of Rights that I think almost were exclusively drafted by George Mason, another Virginian, of course. And this is why I have to talk about this standing up, because these Virginians' ideas are getting trampled by people in Washington. And so the 9th and 10th Amendments stand for this wonderful proposition that all the rights that are not given to the federal government in that box of Article 1, Section 8, and some other provisions, are reserved to the people and the states respectively, if you combine the 9th and 10th Amendments. Well, I mean, I almost call those, I don't know how you feel in Tallahassee, Senator, but those are almost like the forgotten amendments. Nobody talks about those anymore. We don't hardly win cases on federalism anymore. Very rarely does the United States Supreme Court ever rein anything in because it's extra constitutional, meaning it shouldn't be in the province of the federal government. You mentioned the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause is the most, in my view, maybe in the General Welfare Clause, but it's probably the most abused set of words in the Constitution. It's actually the one that gave the authority for the statutes in my case to promulgate federal laws dealing with basically state campaign finance stuff, because it affected interstate commerce. There was a case in the United States Supreme Court, oh gosh, George, it's been, what, 30 years ago, Wickard v. Filburn, that started the path of the destruction of the Commerce Clause. And it basically said, how many lawyers are you a lawyer? You must be a lawyer. But it basically said, you know, you're growing some crops in your backyard at your backyard garden. How many of you had backyard gardens? Shame on you. Did you know that you're affecting interstate commerce? It's true. That's what Wickard v. Filburn said. That's why the government had the ability to regulate your backyard garden, because that affected the stream of commerce. Because if you got stuff out of your backyard, you might not buy stuff at the supermarket, or words to that effect. And so that's the state of the interpretation of our federal powers today. The Congress does pretty much whatever it wants. That's why they have a 14% approval rating. And they will continue to do it until and if the Supreme Court reins them in, or the people rein them in. So I could talk about this a long time, but the point is that Senator was trying to raise is there really does, and I think Governor Bush is exactly right. He'd have been a darn good president too. But he's exactly right on these points of balancing our budget. I mean, we're broke. $20 trillion heading north. The last two presidents have increased the debt from $4 billion to $4 trillion to $20 trillion with no end in sight. And it is immoral to pass this debt on to the next generation. So finding a way to rein that in with a balanced budget is right. Term limits I've always been opposed to, but our system is so broken that things like term limits and bipartisan redistricting are things we might need to talk about. I've always been against them, because both of those are an admission your democracy is so broken that the people are so uneducated they can't pick their officials right, that you have to artificially decide where people vote and how long they can serve. I mean, you've had them here how long, Senator, in Florida?
20 years.
20 years. You know, in an ideal world, the voters are smart enough to see who's the good guys, who's serving well, and who the bums are that need to be thrown out. But if the electorate is not, if you will, engaged or educated enough, or too apathetic, which is a problem in America today, then you have these artificial rules. But, you know, maybe that's where we are. And the third one that he called for was?
Term limits, balanced budget, and limit the Commerce Clause.
And limit the Commerce Clause. Well, that's why I already got on that high horse. So I'm sorry to give you a long answer, but when I look at the things that transcend an individual policy, that have to do with the structure of American government today, I think there are very few things that are more important and more threatening to your liberty than a federal government that cannot impose limits on itself. And that's part of what the Supreme Court, I think, got right in my case, with their rationale. So constitutional conventions can be dangerous because they can get out of control. But there's only a couple ways to amend the Constitution. That's one of them. And, you know, we just may be at that time where that we need to have a national discussion about who are we 240 years into this experiment? What do we want to have decided in Washington? And what do we want to have decided in Tallahassee and Palm Beach? And then let's set the rules right so that the governments are restored to a proper view. And so, I mean, I think this is, for me anyway, and I think for the Senator, this is some of the most important things that we need to do if we want the American public to endure, is to get that balance right again.
Let me leave you and have you leave us with one other point. We had a question from Eric Swanson and from Dr. Hemhold about getting government out of the way and also encouraging good people to run. Mm-hmm. So how do we get citizens to put down their plow, put down their whatever their occupation is, and spend some time in government in this world of a Justice Department that comes after a good and able servant, in a world where we get all this vitriol on TV, where we can go to the cable channel of our choice and watch the people of our ideology attack the other. How are we going to get good people to serve in office? And what can we do as citizens to encourage good people to run?
Well, I think, Mr. President, some of that is your responsibility. As you educate the next generation of Americans here, you impress upon them the duty to serve. I mean, Kennedy had it right. The current president's got it exactly wrong. You know, ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you. Today's rhetoric is exactly the opposite. So you tell these young people about that this experiment won't endure long without people of faith and character and humility that are willing to serve. I mean, Rome and Greece never thought their party would end, and we know what happened there. So while we're a great, great nation, it's just not going to stay that way on the current course. So I think leaders in academia have a real duty. I know you're doing that here. There's people like your former colleague many years before you, Paul Tribble, former U.S. Senator, Christopher Newport, that are really talking about this a lot. Secondly, I think there's a duty within the churches, people of faith, to talk about leadership, the servant leadership model that Jesus had, and to realize that it is really an honorable profession. That's what Romans 13 is all about, is the duty and the privilege of being a servant or civil leader, and what the role is. But Romans 13 calls the civil ruler a minister to do you good and to punish the wrongdoer. So we have to elevate it to that. You know, or again, the vitriol just turns people off so badly. Nobody thinks of you as a public servant or a minister anymore. It's just gone downhill in terms of the view of the calling. And then thirdly, I think I just think there's got to be some efforts among leaders in the broader community, the opinion leaders, the business community, the people that are in the benevolent organizations, to rise up and understand that we do need a strong new generation of people to lead, that really do see this as a calling, and try to mentor young people that they see at a young age, like maybe some of these young ladies that are here, and say, you know, I see something in you. And you may have never thought about this, but there's some things about your personality and your humility that I think would make you great. You know, planting that seed in a young person is remarkable. I don't know how you got your calling. I mean, I was reasonably young, but I mean, it was a couple people that told me those sorts of things. And I guess the last thing I'd say on that, and I don't mean to filibuster. I was in the House. We didn't filibuster there. But
Lots of Senate jokes tonight. Lots of Senate jokes.
I'm sorry, I got two senators here. I can't
There
help
you
it. How many of you read the book Good to Great? It's an amazing book. It's written by a guy named Jim Collins, and I was so impressed with the book. My first couple months as governor, I called him up and I asked him to come out from Colorado Springs to Virginia and to talk to all my cabinet and all of my agency heads, about 150 people, because I wanted them to hear what he had to say about what makes a great leader. And I was also impressed because he said in secular terms what Jesus said in the scripture in very short spiritual terms. And Collins did a 10-year study of thousands and thousands of American businesses and their leaders and try to find out what is it that distinguishes the great leader from the good leader. Because he put only like 5% of American corporations that were in the great category, that were built from the ashes to greatness. And what was the distinguishing factor? And after all that, he decided it came down to one word: humility. It was the leader that was motivated but aggressive and passionate for the organization, not for themselves. And it just says a lot about what kind of leaders we need. And the more people really adopt that philosophy, whether it's in the U.S. Senate or the state Senate or the state governor's office or the business leader's office, the more people you can recruit and call out and affirm their gifts to go into that have that seed within them of humility, but drive at the same time for others and others-centered, the better our country and our states are going to be. So I would say we all have a duty to do that. All of you have seen those kind of people, but you probably missed the opportunity to talk to them and say, you know what, give me 5 minutes because I see something in you and I want to talk to you about it, and I want you to think about serving in public office. So the last bit of your homework is Psalm 35, Philippians 4, what else did I say? George LeMiue's latest book, and the Declaration of Independence, and that last thing I said, and you'll be a better people. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Please give him a round of applause. Thank you, Governor McDonnell.